Dr. Ian Richardson is Assistant Professor at Stockholm University School of Business and a Visiting Fellow at Cranfield University School of Management. His interests include global governance and world politics, and recently he's the lead author of the book Bilderberg People, Elite Power and Consensus in World Affairs. Ian, welcome.
Hi, Tony.
Now, for those that have got just a brief understanding, or perhaps people that have never heard of the Bilderberg Group before, could you just inform everyone what the group initially is, their purpose of the annual meetings are, and generally what gets discussed there?
Yeah, I mean, the Bilderberg Group is probably the most prestigious of all of the elite transnational policy networks. It was formed in the 1950s and essentially is comprised of business and political and financial elites. And what gets discussed there has probably changed quite a little over time. In the early days, when it was formed in the 1950s, I think the principal goal was to try and cement relations between Western Europe and the United States. After obviously the Second World War, there was some fear that some countries, for instance, France, Germany, Italy, may not be as familiar with the United States as perhaps the US would have liked. And so the cementing of relations was considered to be very important, and the Bilderberg Group filled quite an important role at that time. I should point out actually that something that people often overlook, and I've seen an awful lot of speculation about this, and about what the group was doing at the time. You have to remember at the time there weren't so many institutions of international governance, and so as a consequence of that, organizations such as this, networks of this kind, filled quite an important void. If you take NATO, for instance, it's very much a security relationship, very much a formal security organization, but there was no political dimension to that group. So as a consequence, there was no kind of mechanism for making decisions about what exactly NATO was designed to do, what it would do. And in fact, the Bilderberg Group was one of the organizations that attracted the same sorts of people in a sort of convivial, informal setting to try and, in a sense, set the narratives, the informal path down which organizations like NATO and other organizations, for that matter, would follow. So, in many ways, that was the initial. I think, in many ways, that was the initial intent of organizations like Bilderberg. It was very much focused on the security relationship. But over time, it became more important to the cementing of economic relations as well. And of course, you might see security relationships as being the basis to economic relationships anyway. But nevertheless, economic relations are pretty much the focal point, I would say, of much of what is discussed today. That being said, the group has come, very much to the fore again over issues like Iraq. And we see in settings of this kind that a lot of the discussions that led to partisanship in the run-up to the Iraq invasion, for instance, were sort of carried out in settings of this kind. There were many attempts to create consensus, and of course they didn't entirely succeed. But nevertheless, it was in settings and environments like this that we saw an awful lot of elites attempts to create some kind of coherence, some kind of singular narrative.
Brings me on to the next point, which is obviously it's an informal body that meets annually, and it's made up of more or less the leading financiers and policymakers from across the world. Do you think, from the research you did for your book, that one of the controversial issues is because on the one hand it is an informal body which has no legitimacy in terms of decision making or passing laws, yet they're actually debating and making issues? So do you think the issue that the people that serve there aren't elected officials, well, the people specifically working in business, do you think that's an issue that has accelerated the controversy that surrounds the group?
I probably didn't totally answer your first question. I should have actually filled in and said that obviously the group meets every year. 120 or so people meet every year. But what's actually kind of interesting about the group is it's not as homogenous as a lot of people suggest. So for instance, certainly over the last 20 years, which is sort of the period that I've analyzed in depth, I mean, one of the curious aspects of this is that the core of the network is quite small. In the period from 1991 to around 2009, there were just under 1,000 attendees that had been declared. And of that, actually over a half of them had only actually attended once. So that tells you something about how big this group actually is, because one of the things that's often suggested is that this is, if you go once, you're a Bilderberger, and actually that's simply not true. You can be invited and not invited again, and that is actually the norm for most invitees. So you have to exhibit certain, tendencies, certain characteristics, social skills, whatever it may be, in order to be accepted into the group. But the core point I'm trying to make here is that this is not some kind of, tightly knit, unchanging, non-dynamic network. It's a very, at the periphery at least, it's a very dynamic network, because most people don't get to go back. Those at the core of the network probably represent what most people consider to be the Bilderberg group. But even amongst that group, even amongst the steering committee members, you have varying levels of longevity. So it's not the case that if you're a member of the Bilderberg group, you stay a member of the Bilderberg group. I mean, there is no formal membership anyway. This type of network is incredibly fluid. But nevertheless, clearly there are a kind of core group of individuals who seem to represent what the organization or the network stands for.
The organisation is informal and it's obviously quite dynamic in terms of who comes every year. So I just wanted to know two things. The discussions that take place there are obviously informal and off the record. No one can really calculate unless you're there, or it will be a hard instance to measure the cause and effect in this relationship. But how concerned are you that some of the decisions being made here are being made and pushed for consensus by individuals that haven't been elected in their national countries? This would obviously apply for people there that are not politicians. Is that an issue that concerns you, or do you think that it is really just a casual meeting with drinks and people speak off the record? Do you think it's not that serious an issue, or it is?
It's a significant mechanism for the establishment of, for want of a better word, narratives that serve as a basis for more formal interactions, and that in many ways set the scene, the parameters of policy discussion. So on the one hand, you might just see this activity as a kind of sense-making exercise. So, the world is very complex. The issues that we face are incredibly difficult at times. We can't possibly deal with these issues in a singular nation-state fashion. We need to collaborate. And that's not all. We obviously need to collaborate, or this is the thinking at least. We need to collaborate with non-state actors, other stakeholders, because the problems simply transcend the capacity of governments to solve them. So, if you accept all of that, you can see this as a kind of rational sense-making exercise amongst the elite. We're just trying to make sense of the world, and actually we don't really make decisions. What we're trying to do is just trying to create some coherence or some shared understanding, if you like. But that's only half the story in a sense, because although most of the people that go to this network and to this event aren't consciously aware that they're affecting anything, that doesn't mean that they're not. And the processes, the mechanism of bringing in these various stakeholders into a very elite setting, a very exclusive setting, in which very prominent individuals wax lyrical and clearly have quite a significant impression and effect upon certainly new entrants to the group. And even to some well-established members of the group. These fairly central characters can have quite a significant effect on the notion of consensus. Because, one of the things that I've always found really difficult about consensus as an idea is that people sort of see it as somehow mystically emerging out of the fusion of elite minds, or whatever it may be. In any management setting, a consensus is considered to be a good thing. But people largely overlook the dynamics of power that create consensus. And so in answer to your question, do I think it's significant? Do I think that we should be aware of it and in a sense, trying to understand what's taking place. Yes, I do.